welcome everyone. I'm Patricia Kranz, the Executive Director of the Overseas Press Club. I'm delighted to welcome you to one of our series of virtual conversations with the winners of our annual awards. Today, we're honoring the winners of the Whitman Bassow Award, which is for Best Environmental Reporting. And it goes to the BuzzFeed news team of Tom Warren and Katie Baker for their series, World Wildlife Fund's Secret War. We're delighted to have them with us. And the head judge of the Whitman Bassow Award was Kim Murphy, and she is here to interview them. So take it away, Kim.
Hey, hello everybody. I am just really happy and honored to be here. I served, as Patricia said, as the head judge on the panel that was looking at entries in the Whitman Bassow Award, and it was a tough field. There were just some excellent entries, a lot of really terrific stuff on climate change, and the problems in the Amazon, the disappearing rainforests, and then we read these stories that Tom and Katie did for BuzzFeed, looking at the World Wildlife Fund and their operations across Asia and Africa to try to bring some kind of control to the mass extinction that's been going on of rhinos and elephants and tigers. And we were just blown away because while this had been something that had been sort of hinted at in the past, there had been some NGO work on it, on the issue of the degree to which the World Wildlife Fund, one of the world's largest international wildlife conservation organizations, had sort of known about some human rights abuses that were going on. These two managed to spend a year reporting and document it and nail it down and leave very little doubt as to the level of knowledge and culpability of senior leaders of that organization. And their work was borne out when the World Wildlife Fund launched its own independent investigation headed by a former UN Commissioner on Human Rights, which basically upheld all of the major points in their reporting. And that just came out recently. They covered that as well. What they looked at specifically was the way in which country representatives in, I think, 40 or 70 countries around the world, World Wildlife Fund operates, had been basically helping some of these local anti-poaching squads militarize. They were helping them not get weapons, although there's something to be said about that at some point. But jeeps and uniforms and facilities that would help them go out and confront these, let's face it, really dangerous poachers who are brutally slaughtering some of these animals for sometimes hundreds of thousands of dollars that these animal parts can get on the open market. And what they found was that some of these so-called eco guards were engaging in violence of their own. And this included murder, gang rape, torture, waterboarding. I mean, really shocking stuff that certainly the World Wildlife Fund was not engaging in, but they knew about it and they didn't do anything. That's probably the gist of their reporting. I'd like to start out just letting you in on just the sort of the essence of what their reporting found by looking at the top of their first story, which started off in Nepal, near the renowned Chitwan National Park, which is an area of protection for Royal Bengal tigers, one-horned rhinos, and crocodiles. This will give you a gist of what their stories were showing. Down the road from the crocodile ponds inside Nepal's renowned Chitwan National Park, in a small clearing shaded by sala trees, sits a jail. Hira Chaudhary went there one summer night with boiled green maize and chicken for her husband, Shekharam, a farmer who had been locked up for 2 days. Shekharam was in too much pain to swallow. He crawled toward Hira, his thin body covered in bruises, and told her through sobs that forest rangers were torturing him. Quote, "They beat him mercilessly and put salt water in his nose and mouth," Hira later told police. The rangers believed that Shekharam had helped his son bury a rhinoceros horn in his backyard. They couldn't find the horn, but they threw Shekharam in their jail anyway, court documents filed by the prosecution show. 9 days later, he was dead. An autopsy showed 7 broken ribs and blue marks and bruises all over his body. 7 eyewitnesses corroborated his wife's account of nonstop beatings. 3 park officials, including the chief warden, were arrested and charged with murder. And they go on to show that those officials who were arrested, that the prosecution was vociferously opposed by the World Wildlife Fund. And when the charges were dropped and they were released, the World Wildlife Fund issued a press release applauding that. So that just gets you into the story. And now I'd like to maybe start with Tom and Katie, 2 investigative reporters for BuzzFeed who did this work, spent a year on it. Tom, can you just sort of give us an idea of how you got on this story?
Sure, yeah, no, first of all, thank you very much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here. The genesis of the story was actually quite some time ago when I was a much younger man doing an undergraduate degree in social anthropology. And we were studying Baka and Mbangeli communities in the Congo Basin. And our lecturer had said to us, well, actually, one of the greatest risks that these communities face is conservation, and mentioned it, and kind of described some of the issues that they faced. This was in the mid-2000s, when I'd been to university, and it had always stuck with me. And later as a journalist, I thought, I really want to do this story, but you kind of wait until some stories you wait until you feel capable of doing them, that you're kind of ready to take it on. So I started working on it, and my brilliant colleague Katie Baker joined me soon after, and we kind of gradually peeled back the layers of secrecy on it, and did the reporting. And yeah, it was a real pleasure to work on as a project.
And what was the essence of what you had heard? I mean, was it that that World Wildlife Fund conservation workers were actively involved in this, or that this was just generally going on across a number of organizations, or what?
So what I had initially heard was that, my lecturer had said that actually these parks aren't these kind of benign places. There are rangers who commit offences against local communities, and that the charities haven't really acted on it. And since the time that I'd heard that, there were also NGOs looking at this issue, and there's been, over the last 5 years, but particularly the last 3, it's had kind of increasing attention, both at the level of the UN as well as NGOs, but there were always suspicions, people could see the output of what was going on. They could see the villager who had been attacked, but they couldn't see the full context of that. How was an international NGO involved in this? What did they know? What did they ignore? And those were the questions that we wanted to answer, not what's the output of a system, but what's going on kind of behind the curtain, behind the veil. So, and that's kind of what we set out to do.
And Katie, can you talk a little bit about some of the hurdles that lay between deciding to prove that and proving it? Because as I understand it, they were considerable.
Yes, I think that for years, activist groups had done really important work saying these are happening, these people in these communities have complaints, but WWF kept saying, well, we'll look into these allegations. And of course, we take human rights really seriously, but there's no conclusive proof. There's no conclusive evidence. And in my opinion, they were dismissive of a lot of these complaints, publicly saying, these are just activists with an axe to grind. And it, because there was no paper trail. And that was a real hurdle because these are really marginalized communities. They don't trust the law, the authorities. And even if they did, they don't necessarily have access and, in the depths of the jungle to go to a doctor if they're abused or to find a lawyer to pay for any of this, really. So I think part of the reason that WWF was able to dismiss a lot of this for years was because it was very hard to nail this down. And as investigative reporters, of course, we want documents. And so finding documents, legal documents, medical documents to corroborate these allegations was difficult. And it took us a long time to do it, but we did do it. And I do think that's part of the reason why there's been so much impact as a result of our work, even though our work did definitely build upon allegations that were out there already by some of these groups, because we were able to find this paper trail, which includes everything from medical and legal records to a memoir in which one of the poaching suspects from that Nepal case confessed that had never come to light. And lastly, I'd say that just gaining the trust of these communities and took months and figuring out, how to make sure that people from these Indigenous groups would open up to us and feel comfortable. That was a real challenge, both logistically to get there and, as Westerners coming into a country that we don't live in. So that I think had been a hurdle to some of this being out there before. And so I'm really grateful that we were able to take the time and had the resources to do that.
Yeah. So did you start in Nepal? That's where your first piece at least starts off in. Is that where the first place that you looked at? And I noticed that you did that as a co-reporting venture with the Kathmandu Post as well. How did that? Can you just sort of tell us how you started checking into that situation?
Yeah, well, so we started out, we're both based in London, and we started out by looking at a lot of different countries and trying to figure out where we felt we could go do reporting. And first, Tom and I went to Cameroon, where we had more sourcing and we did a lot of work there. But before that, I had heard that in Nepal, there was this court case, this decade-old court case. And I got the legal documents, but they were in Nepali, and it was difficult to find somebody that could translate them because it was, hundreds of pages of Nepali court records. And so it took a few months to get those back. And I remember the day that we got them back, it had taken a while, and I read them and I thought, oh my God, these are the legal records we had been looking for that we thought might not exist in this case. And it just, there was the autopsy, there were witness testimonies, there was everything. It was a really exciting moment for us and horrifying because it was, very distressing. And so I went to Nepal after we had already been to Cameroon, but we led with that in part because there was just such a clear record of what had happened from both sides that we felt that was really strong. And
was it pretty much that one case, or did you find that there was other similar stuff happening in Nepal?
There were dozens of cases, and we got into some of them. And there was actually just a recent case kind of similar this summer. But yeah, there were multiple cases, but this was the one where it had gone as far as court documents, where the prosecution had filed these. And as reporters, because with this story, WWF had been able to be dismissive for so long, saying, well, where are the records? We wanted to start with, well, here's 100 pages of documents. And of course, then, I went to Nepal and I interviewed all the people involved. And the reason we did it as a partnership is, usually oftentimes when you go to another country where you don't speak the language, you get a fixer and a translator. And in Cameroon, we did all those things. But in Nepal, we had a colleague who was working at the Kathmandu Post who introduced us to this great reporter, Searing. And she, we thought, well, let's do it as a collaboration with this part where you can take this part and do it as your own story that's more local. And then we'll use what we find, and we'll share the documents that we have with you. And because we felt like there was a local story and this international story. So I'm really happy with how that turned out and that we were able to do that with the Kathmandu Post.
Yeah, their piece turned out very well as well.
Mhm.
So, so these court documents existed, and in the case of that first guy who died after being beaten and probably tortured, the charges were all dropped against those guys. What happened with that? How did they manage to get out from under that? And what were you able to find out whether the World Wildlife Fund had done any direct lobbying or had any influence in getting those charges dropped?
Yeah, I think that it was interesting to read the report that WWF commissioned that came out a few weeks ago, and they did address this, and they said that it was irresponsible for WWF to have played the role that they did there in terms of being supportive of one side over the other before there had been any investigation. What we heard and what we reported is that there was just a lot of pressure on the government to drop the charges. But what I think, again, the fact that after the case, even after all these charges were dropped, not only were there similar cases, but the people accused, they confessed to waterboarding and torturing suspects with other officials, and in one case in this self-published book, which in WWF never really seemed to notice that these people that they continued to work with, and in one case actually handed an award to, were freely saying yes, not in the case of Shikaram, they had denied it, but in other cases they went, yeah, that's how we interrogate suspects, that's how we get anything out of them, which I found.
Yeah, there was this one quote from that book that you guys highlighted in your story, which I thought this was from the assistant warden of that national park, and who said, yes, I'm writing here about, I waterboarded and tortured poaching suspects. Yes, he said, I could have hidden the truth and not talked about it in the book, but I didn't, because I wanted to present the real scenario. I wanted to let people know about the situation at the time and say, this is what had to be done to save the rhinos.
Right, and part of WWF's response before our story was always, well, we didn't know this was happening. This book was in English and it was an ebook available on Amazon. So, it wasn't, I'd like to say that it was really difficult to uncover for me, but this was all out there. And, something else that either Tom or I could speak to is also WWF itself had commissioned a lot of reports where they had sent people into the field in different countries to see whether these abuses were indeed happening. And that was a big part of our reporting as well, in terms of a paper trail where, at the beginning we didn't know this, but we eventually uncovered over half a dozen reports that WWF commissioned itself that found that these abuse allegations were credible, were happening, that the charity had to take action. And all the while they were saying, well, we don't really know if these are credible.
So Tom, how did they explain away those previous reports and investigations they had done themselves, which I think went back to like 2015, right?
Yeah, so there had been a very famous case where an NGO had launched a case at the OECD against WWF, and WWF's argument publicly had always been, well, the government employs the rangers, they're not our responsibility. But the reports that we looked at would all say to the charity, you need to do something about this, here are recommendations. And it was the same things time and time again. It was, clear lines of responsibility between yourselves and the rangers, functioning complaint systems, and also broader things such as more engagement with Indigenous communities, that actually, the charity isn't engaging with the Indigenous communities that live around the parks. And we know that in the case of at least one of these reports that had gone to board level, we know that they were discussed at the very top level of the charity. And what was interesting for us is that there were a lot of commonalities between those reports, in terms of not just the kinds of abuses, but the kinds of recommendations that were made. And it was, as a reporter, this story had, normally you work on a project and you'll get one or two real light bulb moments where you get your hands on something and you think, oh my God, we've unlocked the door, this is it. And the wonderful thing about reporting this out was that I think there were probably like 15 moments where Katie and I looked at each other and went, oh my God, we've got it, so that, as a reporter, it's always a pleasure to to find those things that kind of stand up your story. And
you had told me that there was a moment when a source was it in Cameroon or somewhere in Africa, who had actually just handed you over a bunch of stuff, right?
Yeah, so we, the one thing that we were looking for, the kind of golden goose, was we wanted a park management plan that would put in documentary form for us, here are WWF's responsibilities and here's what they're funding. And we couldn't get one. Like, we were really struggling, and we were in a very remote location, and somebody, I mean, it was basically a, like a hut in the middle of the rainforest, and somebody approached us, and they had something that looked like, I don't know if you guys have the yellow pages, like a phone book, it was this huge tome, and they put it down. They were like, yeah, the problem is you can't take it away. And we do a lot of, I do a lot of big data projects where we use documents. And so we sat there and we thought, well, we've got an SLR camera, I mean, there's no light there. It's a generator with a tiny light bulb. And, you're in a hut with, maybe, I think there were maybe 15 other people kind of milling about, cooking dinner.
Mm-hmm.
And we were like, well, we have to have, we must have this document. We must have all of it, that, we don't know what's in there. We just need it. And so we got a long bench, and we opened it up, and we'd take turns, one of us holding it open whilst the other one took a picture of the pages. And it took us, I mean, it must have taken hours, I think, wasn't it, Katie? It was,
also very dark. It was kind of pitch black and there was a bad generator. The whole thing was, but we were so excited that, because it was a really important document for us to get, because another difficulty is that, as I think is really well laid out in the recent report, this whole structure of WWF is I think in some ways seems purposefully complex. You never know who's funding who, and how much money is going to what. And so this, like Tom said, was the first time where we were able to understand what money was going towards anti-poaching law enforcement type things.
Right.
It was it was just one of those moments where you just you see something, you just think amazing. When we came back and told our editor what we'd done, he was kind of amazed, and it just sticks out as one of the best moments in my career, of like, that we just took a picture of every single page, and then put it in a massive PDF. But I mean, it talks to a kind of truth in reporting, particularly in working internationally, that we bring these kind of amazing technologies with us, and you go out, you find things, and you record them, whether it's video or, with a camera, however, and you bring it back to your office, and, we put it in, I mean, this is a bit geeky, but we OCR'd it, so it was all word searchable. And then we could just pile through the document, kind of researching it. And it was a really unusual mix of kind of foreign correspondency and kind of data journalism in one experience, so.
Well, if you could take a minute and take us into the foreign correspondent story, I would love to hear about your trip to Cameroon, because it sounded like it was epic in so many ways. One of the reasons that made me decide it was epic was just that one photo in your story of that road that was in Cameroon, right? It was it was like a mud hole. It was like there was a truck sort of leaning on its side in a pothole that was bigger than the truck. There were people valiantly trying to get along on dirt covered motorbikes, and you guys had to go way. That is like one of the is it the largest protected rainforest in Africa, I think, where you were working? Just take us along on your trip on what that was like to get out there and do that reporting.
Yeah, I could start and I'll hand it over to you, Tom. It took us 3 days to get from the capital, Yaoundé, to Lobeke, just because the roads are not great. And the rainy season had just ended. We were eager to get out there at that time, just because we had been working on this story for so long and we were ready. I think in retrospect, the roads were still very muddy, and you have to move very slowly, and you have to stop and get out and kind of walk around all the holes. So it took a long time to get there. And once we were there where the Baka live, and there's no phone service and really nothing else out there other than, these people in their communities, our car broke down because it was too much mud for it to take. And we were stuck there for a while, and it was, it wasn't unsafe, and we had a really great team, and our sources were really helpful, but yeah, we had to kind of get out of there on motorbikes, which I know, Tom, you can describe that further if you'd like.
Yeah, I mean, it was, I've been some remote places, but this was like the most remote place I'd ever been. It was the road that ran, you're at that spot where kind of, Cameroon and Central African Republic and DRC all kind of meet up, and there's this one road that just runs into DRC, and we were about 50 kilometers down it in the middle of nowhere, and the car just died. And that increasing sense of panic where you start off smiling and being like, all right, I'm just going to sit in the sun and do my notes, and maybe we'll just, it will be okay. And after kind of,
or maybe we'll never come back.
Yeah, you're just like, oh, okay, now things have gone very bad, and the sat phone's not working, and we'd met some brilliant people. There was one particularly just wonderful human being that we'd met on our travels who arranged motorbikes to come and get us. And so we basically, whatever we could out of the car, we threw on our backs, and we could only go one at a time. So you just sat on the back of a motorbike speeding through the rainforest. And it's like, it was like some amazing roller coaster ride through the most pristine, beautiful, because it's just you and a motorbike, so you can hear the birds, and you can hear there are primates there and other things kind of crashing through the jungle floor, and it honestly was one of the best. It was the best experience of my life, I think.
Yeah, it was beautiful, and we also, some of the women in the community took us fishing one day, and we got to go with them, and they laughed at us a lot because obviously, we're city people, and they using machetes to kind of cut through the brush and then get to the water, and they showed us, I mean, it was an important part of our story, just how these people really rely on the natural resources of the forest, and they do it in this way that is good for conservation. That's kind of the truth of how these people live. They're not the poachers who are coming in and doing real harm to endangered species. They're using the forest in a sustainable way, and we got to watch them fish and gather, and that was really meaningful. And yeah, we got mocked a lot for just kind of being like tripping over things, but that was great. And then eventually we did have to rent a series of cars. I don't even remember how we did it to make it back. Just kind of crouched into small spaces for hours at a time. And yeah, it was definitely, I would not recommend going there at the end of rainy season. That was in retrospect.
Yeah, and I remember, I mean, one, we'd hire cars to take us like just one or two villages up to just try and, to weave hundreds of kilometers. And at one point we had, and it was just a bad vibe, like a drunk local policeman, and the locals there are really afraid of the police. And this guy was hammered. And funnily enough, you mentioned that photograph that we took of the kind of mud bowl. The one thing that you don't see in the photograph there is the policeman was fed up of waiting, and he wanted to drive through people's front gardens, and he just went through and started kicking things out of people's front gardens, shouting at them. So you had this really bizarre juxtaposition where he had
jumped on our car. I feel like he had kind of like decided to hitch a ride on the back of one of the cars we had gotten, to be clear. So we kind of had this drunk police officer sitting on the top of the car yelling at people to get out of the way.
Yeah. You became part of the problem.
Yeah, at that point we were not capable. We were just like, I guess this is how we are going to get through this.
Yeah, we expressly did not have a choice about our guest, and it was just one of those signs, because there's a lot of roadblocks, and parts of the road run down the border of the Central African Republic. You have refugees coming over. It's a really unstable, kind of unstable part of the world as well. So there were so many different tensions and factors on the people who lived there, that it was, you had the kind of beauty of the jungle, and alongside it, some really kind of terrible problems as well. But
let me take just a minute to interject here to those who are joining us today, that we would love to hear some questions from all of you to our panelists. So we have the chat function at the bottom of your Zoom window that you can put some questions in there. If you'd rather just ask them yourself, you can raise your hand, and Chad, who's with us today, can help you with that too. So we're going to talk for a few more minutes, and then we'll break out and see if there's anything that you guys want to ask. But just to talk a little bit more on your work in Cameroon, you know, you were also hearing from people some firsthand accounts of some really serious stuff that had been going on, right? What were you learning from like the villagers, and what were they telling you about whether they had reported this before and been listened to?
Yeah, it just seemed like every village we went to, everyone had a story they wanted to tell. And we tried, you know, there had been some complaints filed by an advocacy group on behalf. We had read complaints filed by an advocacy group, but obviously, you know, we needed to go and talk to those people themselves directly to see if they matched up with what we had read. And it was really, really shocking to just hear firsthand what these people said that they had experienced, and how, you know, they would say, we never see anyone from WWF. We would tell them, well, you know, why didn't you use the complaint system they say they have? And they would say, what complaint system? There was just they said there was a total lack of outreach, and they really felt completely abandoned and lost and scared. And just going village after village and hearing these same stories of both historic and more recent abuse was really harrowing. I don't know, Tom, if you want to add.
Yeah, I mean, I think the case that really stood out for us was there was a case where a young boy had been tortured in front of his parents. That rangers believed that they knew about poaching, not even that they had necessarily been involved. And they thought the best way to elicit information from the mum and dad was to torture the kid in front of them. So what they do is they whip them with the blunt ends of the machetes, so across the back and on the soles of the feet. And you know, through the advocacy group, this family had made a complaint, but the charity had never gone to meet the family to hear the circumstances of it. You know, I'll always actually, it's one of the interviews in my career that really sticks out, because you know, this young man, he looked really deeply traumatized. He was a really young kid, and it kind of really, I don't know, it really stuck with me. It was really kind of quite an uncomfortable account to hear. So, you know, and that became a central part of our reporting, that, you know, these complaints were being made, but there was no follow-up on them, you know, and normally it's incumbent on organizations when, you know, you think about an allegation that a child was tortured by one of your partners, you would investigate, you know, that you'll go and find out what had happened, and that hadn't been the case.
And I just want to add there that it wasn't just that WWF had a complaint mechanism that wasn't working, that they themselves had commissioned reports by human rights investigators repeatedly to go interview people and talk to them. And they knew that these allegations of torture and rape and sometimes murder were a problem. So it's not like Tom and I were brought this to their attention, which that really stuck with me, kind of the institutional angle, that, you know, it would be bad enough, and in my opinion, if Tom and I were the first people who had said, maybe you have to go speak with these communities, but we were not the first. And but it took until our reporting, which couldn't be ignored, for there to be more action. And I think that's important to remember.
And I know that for the most part in your stories, you know, the World Wildlife Fund put out, you know, statements that said, you know, if there are human rights abuses, we would take that very seriously, and we're investigating everything that we know about this, and we don't go along with this at all. And they had said in the past that, you know, that these were the host country employees who were doing this, and they can try to advise and counsel, but it's ultimately not their responsibility. But I think I wondered what degree you were able to engage with them, because I know that I think one of you had told me that for the most part, when you tried to talk to WWF people in country, they asked you a question, you know, like, why are you looking here? Why are you not looking at what Trump is doing? And I think that one of the central questions about your reporting in this whole project that's elicited some of the most interesting discussion in the comments and so on is the whole issue of, well, wait a minute, what about that dead rhinoceros whose horn has been hacked off of it? What about that elephant baby who's crying next to her mother who has been killed? What about the fact that we only have like half a dozen tigers in this place and they're all going to be gone by next week if these people don't do something about it? They're putting their own lives on the line. And we know that a lot of these eco guards have been killed themselves. They face mortal danger and surely have the right to defend themselves. So can you talk about how you handled those sort of moral questions, those equivalencies, and access to people on the conservation side to talk about their views on this?
Yeah, maybe I can speak a little bit about the first part, and then Tom can talk more about the why aren't you reporting on Trump. I think that something we tried to make really clear in our story is that obviously poaching is a huge problem, and WWF does a lot of really important work on that front. But to use kind of it's not a perfect analogy, but going after these indigenous communities, first of all, it's like trying to solve the drug war by going after the 16-year-old kid on the corner, in America, and saying that murdering him is okay because he might be involved at a very low level. A lot of these communities also, first of all, these were allegations, and in all the cases we reported on, there were suspects of knowing about poaching, and in response to that, they were being allegedly tortured and raped and murdered. But these are not the enemy. These indigenous groups, they're stewards of the areas. They are part of conservation, and even WWF admits that in a lot of its own materials. The poachers doing the most harm are much really powerful, coming in from out of the area and going after these small communities is just not the solution, both because in many cases they're not actually participating, and in the cases where they are, it's because they have no other source of income and no other source of getting food, in part because of the way that conservation has limited them from accessing resources in what is often a very kind of safe and fair way. So it's a very complex problem, and we tried to get that across in our story. But I think what I hope people take away from is that these groups, from the Baka to the Taru, just thousands of miles away from each other, are all facing the same problem. They should be working with conservationists. We should not be trying to we should not be working against them, if that makes sense. And then Tom, maybe you can speak a bit to kind of like the fact that I think this was an open secret, but people didn't want to talk about it because they said, well, we're doing really important work. Yeah, there's this thing where maybe there's some collateral damage, but what about the tigers?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, even for us reporting out, and Katie and I would discuss it, it would cause us sleepless nights. Like, I've kind of considered myself an environmentalist, and I was really troubled sometimes. I used to sit there and think, what's going to be the impact of this story? And I think there are different stories that we write. Sometimes they're stories of outright wrongdoing, and sometimes they're just stories of blindness. There is a really human psychological element to journalism and in the things that we report on. And sometimes, because we are so focused on one thing, we can become blind to others. And perhaps this is one of those cases. We met many, many, many good people who didn't want to speak to us because they were conservationists, and they said, this isn't, but the one thing that nobody across the board, none of the eco guards, none of the field directors. We did in fact get breakthroughs where we did. When you read the stories, obviously you see the reporting in perhaps Cameroon or Nepal, but we were also doing kind of a lot of work both in the US and Europe, because conservationists would go out and work there, and then they'd come back, to wherever they lived,
And we did interview Dominic O'Neill. He granted us an interview. So.
Yeah, he did, but we were also meeting conservationists who would have.
And for the audience, who's Dominic O'Neill?
He's the COO. So we went to, at the end of our story, obviously we gave WWF a chance to comment, and we went to Geneva where they're based, and we did speak with them just to make it clear that,
no, in the context of the right to reply process, there was conversation, but it was more in, going out and trying to find people like, hey, you were in this park in whatever year when this happened, what do you know about it? And people would say like, oh, you seem like a nice guy, but why are you doing this? Why don't you go and do a story about Donald Trump? Like, Donald Trump is the bad guy. And, and it's one of those things. It was just a kind of blindness as to what was going on. People didn't almost want to think about it because they were saving animals. And, it's, it was a real insight into kind of human complexity and how easily we can become blinded to some of our other responsibilities when we were on a mission, So.
Well, in fact, some of the commentators weren't blinded. They said these people deserve it. Definitely that attitude.
And I think that's the other thing, to say that the only way to stop extinction is to rape, torture, and murder Indigenous people. I just think that we have to do better than that, right?
And I mean, it's something that, we did a story about WWF, but this is a systemic issue in conservation. Other conservation groups have this issue. And it's kind of something that's been discussed around the conservation industry for a very, very long time. But I mean, the one thing I did learn is that some people, particularly commentators underneath stories or on Facebook, certainly love animals more than people. And I can say I got some of the most inventive emails I've ever received after publishing that story, we should drop you in the jungle and you should be hunted by poachers and, that sort of thing. So,
nice.
we got a lot of interesting communiques after publication.
So Chad, we have a question in the Q&A. Did you want to enable that or bring that forward?
Yes, I can read that for you. Absolutely. We have a couple of questions lined up. One is, could you talk more about how you were funded for the project and how you chose to spend that funding on your reporting?
So we don't have, we're very fortunate in that we don't have to kind of submit budget proposals as we go for projects. I mean, BuzzFeed is very supportive and, went to our editor and we were like, we'd like to do this project, but it might cost some money. And they were like, just go for it. And obviously we had one eye on it. You don't ignore these things, but we didn't kind of sit down and kind of formally plan it out as such. And sometimes it's really difficult to do as well because you don't know where the reporting's gonna take you, and that means that you can incur costs that you didn't anticipate or expect. But our unit at BuzzFeed, our investigations team, is geared towards doing kind of complex, ambitious public interest reporting, and they give us a lot of support to do that, and almost every project I've been there, I've felt that. I think that's
I just wanted to say I'm so grateful. There are very few places, especially these days, that would have let two reporters spend a year. We traveled to, I think, 5 different countries collectively by the end of it. It took a lot of time and it's expensive just logistically discussing Cameroon, to support that type of project and keep the reporter safe and do it ethically and do it right and get the goods. And I am really grateful that BuzzFeed is a place that saw the value of this story and allowed us to use these resources to complete it.
I mean, a related question from the audience on that. Someone is wondering, how did you persuade your editors that it was going to be worth it, that this was going to pan out, that an issue that had been around forever and nobody could prove it, you were going to be able to do it? And did they know it was going to take you a year?
Yeah. Sorry. Do you want to go ahead?
No, after you go.
I was just going to say, with this story, I think almost a problem in the beginning. After a few months of research, we had so many leads that it was time to start traveling. And I think that we were lucky in that we knew that once we got out there, we would be able to get what we needed. For example, we knew about the court documents before I went to Nepal. We had the complaints from Cameroon before we went there to do the in-person interviews. So by the time the majority of the money that and time was spent on the international travel, but we took the time to source up and get the documents beforehand. And then once we had them, we were able to go to our editors and say, we have these records, we have these documents, now we have to go do the interviews. And by that time, they could see the value in the project because we had that. I don't know if you agree, Tom.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I mean, in the early phase of the project before Kate joined, there were times where we have a brilliant editor, Alex Campbell, and I'd say to him, like, Alex, I don't know if we can pull this off. And he was like, no, you just have to keep going, keep knocking on doors. And the amazing thing about BuzzFeed is that they actively commission wild goose chases. So I've gone to them with stories before and they've been like, nah.
That's the quote of the panel, everybody. BuzzFeed, they actively commission wild goose chases.
Yeah, and it's brilliant. You know, I can remember when I started there, a British journalist, and I'd be like, look, this is a big issue in the UK. And they'd be like, have people written about it? And they're like, yeah, but we can do more. And they're like, no, I don't want that. They're like, we want something completely blank canvas. And that's really liberating, you know, and, to the point where when I was training and everywhere else that I've worked, you always get told, pitch a story, not an issue, come with, here's the story, not the issue. Whereas at BuzzFeed, you can go, here's the issue. And these are the likely stories. Can we go and do it? And they'll go, yeah, go and have a crack. And that's a great thing for a reporter,
Yeah, absolutely. And then kind of going back to, the guys who told you, well, why aren't you reporting about what Trump is doing? Can you talk a little bit about you also did a story about the millions of dollars that the US government invests in some of these efforts, these anti-poaching efforts through the Fish and Wildlife Service, I guess. Can you talk about the level of funding and knowledge and involvement of the US authorities? And I guess that there were some investigations on the US side done and some funding suspensions.
Yeah, I think that we had a really hard time. We filed FOIAs and we didn't get anything back, and we tried to source up and we couldn't get the information. And when we published our first series of stories, we did not know that much about the US funding. That was not something that was part of that first series. But then after that, there was a bipartisan congressional investigation launched into the issue. And then all of a sudden, we started getting leaked documents and tips. And once it was brought more to the attention of interested parties, we stayed on the story. And I think this really shows the value of staying on a story, because 6 months later, we published stories more about the US. We were able to obtain further reports showing just that the highest up people at WWF knew about this. And we were also able to obtain information about the funding that showed that USAID and US DOI money from the Interior Department was going to law enforcement, anti-poaching issues at the parks where they had major problems with human rights abuses. And, I think it's very complex because, you don't want to stop funding for these very important projects. But I do think that if the US or any other country is giving money to parks abroad, they should, the people asking for that money should be able to say, these are the steps we are taking to make sure that this is done fairly to the Indigenous people, that we're getting their consent to start these projects, that we're making sure that they're not being abused. That seems like something that should be necessary. And I think what WWF and other groups have said in the past was there's no way to guarantee that. Like, this is just collateral damage. This is something that's going to happen if we work in these really difficult areas. From my perspective, I think that's not enough. I think they have to do better. And thanks to our reporting and the investigations, the subsequent investigations, now they will have, if anyone wants money from whether WWF or other groups, they will have to be much clearer about what they'll do to prevent this. And I consider that a success.
And I guess one of the difficulties in this whole issue is in fact, that relationship that the WWF and other conservation organizations have with their host governments. And they're dealing with here some governments that are really not the most democratic or responsive in the world. And in some, I know that in some of the issues that you looked at, for example, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, there did appear to be some substantial level of knowledge on the part of the World Wildlife Fund about what was going on, but they just sort of blatantly said that that this was oversight from the host country's wildlife agency, and it would what did they say? It would upset their relationship with them, or what are the issues, the government issues involved in some of this?
Yeah. So I mean, it is, you know, and on this, you know, I think I have sympathy for any conservation group, is they do work in these amazingly difficult parts of the world, and some of the state actors that they work with do not have the cleanest track records when it comes to human rights. Now, you know, in the case of Salonga National Park, where some of the worst abuses had happened, it's now emerged that actually a WWF manager at the park had reported his own concerns about what had gone on at the park. And
what happened when he did?
Well, I mean, we don't know immediately what happened, but it seems like there wasn't widespread focus until an NGO started looking at it, and then we reported it sometime later. I mean, the key issue really is that, you know, if you're going to do this kind of work, you just need to have really rigid safeguards in place so that if things start going wrong, that, you know, you can kind of put them under control again. And
well, I think it's also important to add that WWF itself had said before any of this, they said we would never let this happen. We have these safeguards. So it might be true that it is true that they are working in these very difficult areas, and it's very complex work, but they themselves have upheld a commitment to human rights and to say this shouldn't happen, and that they're going to get consent from Indigenous people, and they're going to protect them. And they say that's a cornerstone of their work. So to say that and then be afraid to bother governments when they are, you know, when their eco guards are accused of gang rape and murder, as they were in Salonga, is, I think it's going against their own stated values, which I think is important to note.
I mean, what are the incentives as far as the governments go? I mean, I imagine that they have been strongly urged and incentivized to deal with these poaching problems, right? And cut off the supply to the black market. So they might well respond that we're doing what we can. You told us what you wanted us to do was stop poaching. And now you're telling us that you don't want us to work very hard at doing that. I mean, is there something to do about the contracts and relationships with the government that's a problem here?
I mean, again, I think that at the bare minimum, saying that, you know, gang rape is not acceptable when trying to combat poaching, it sounds like I'm being flippant, but, you know, like it's one thing to acknowledge how difficult it is, and it's a complex issue. And it's another thing to not, you know, WWF, and it has started doing this more, but, you know, if poachers are accused, you know, if anti-poaching forces are accused of these horrific crimes that have nothing to do with protecting animals, they have to say, you know, you have to prosecute this, take it seriously, this can't be acceptable. And I think, again, we're talking about these like very egregious crimes that are obvious. It obviously shows that there's no accountability, no oversight, which to me is just a very basic first step that's not even that complex at all.
Yeah. And then finally, can we talk a little bit about, you know, this independent investigation that had been commissioned by the World Wildlife Fund? I mean, did you get the sense that it was really, truly an independent inquiry? To what extent do you feel that that it confirmed what you saw? Did it turn up anything that you hadn't known about before? And is this going to result in any change in behavior, do you think?
Tom, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, sure. So I think, I mean, with regard to its independence or its finding, I mean, certainly some groups, certainly Indigenous rights groups had been quite critical of the independent review, particularly in that it didn't actually declare findings. So there was no yes, no answer as to culpability, although it did outline a lot of issues that displayed clear culpability and advocated for some quite deep changes. I mean, interestingly, one of the areas following on from what we were just talking about that they advocate for change on is PR, where they kind of presented enforcement and rangers in this wholly positive light, and then anything that was bad. They said in the report, you know, people wouldn't raise issues about Rangers because they didn't want to kind of rock the boat. You know, they were, you know, they were a key part of the PR. We don't want to like say anything bad about them. So, you know, it was like many of these reports, it's kind of a game of two halves. But
so you felt like they didn't really do the job.
Yeah, I mean, we feel, you know, it kind of indicates our reporting. So, you know, it did kind of, there was a lot more to see the degree of detail in there. Was for us kind of quite an astonishing thing, you know.
They reported stuff you guys didn't have, like really, yeah. I mean, you probably knew it, but didn't put it in your stories, but yeah, they had quite a lot.
I think for me, it was gratifying to have our reporting validated. What was frustrating to me is that before our stories came out, something that WWF would do is whenever an issue arose, they would say, you know, we're going to create more policies. And then, you know, like there's a lot of work done on paper and they had all these principles that looked really good, but then in practice, they weren't working out on the ground. And I think what I was hoping for was a bit more accountability and change. And it seemed like this report validated our reporting, but then suggested more policies. And the problem has never been policies. They've always had really good policies around human rights. And they've said, well, we're going to do this complaint mechanism and we're going to do all this stuff. And so to see just the suggestions be more of that when it clearly hasn't been working in the past, I found disheartening because I think that more has to be done. But I also think that there's been lots of change, and I think WWF does a lot of really good work. And I hope that now, you know, I have been gratified to see that in the past year, whenever human rights abuse allegations have arisen, as they have in Nepal and you know, in the DRC. I don't know, I won't say why this is different, but now there's no more secret reports. You know, now it's public. They say publicly, we're going to cut the funding, we're going to investigate, and WWF is under a lot more pressure to do the right thing and be more transparent. So I do think that's great, and I hope that they continue to do so. But yeah, the report I did not think held the right people accountable, really.
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of organizational accountability, you know, there's a question as to whether that's occurred, you know, who dropped the ball and where. But I think in terms of, you know, also kind of systemic accountability is that speaking to people in the field, you know, that other conservation groups have taken note as well, that this was an issue that impacted almost, you know, a number of conservation groups. And in fact, as a sector, it's now starting to kind of do a bit more kind of self-assessment, even self-criticism around the history of conservation. You know, conservation has done wonderful things, but over its history, going all the way back to Yosemite National Park, it's also come at great cost, normally to Indigenous groups. So hopefully there'll be more awareness in the future. You know, we certainly hope that will be the case. Yeah.
Well, thanks to both of you for sharing the background to your just terrific reporting. For all of you who have not read WWF's Secret War, you absolutely should. It will take you about 2 weeks. I think there's a lot of stuff there. There's a link to it on the OPC's invitation to this. And I really enjoyed it. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much. It meant so much to get this award. So thanks again.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Kim, Katie, and Tom. It was a fascinating conversation.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye.